Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of the program is World Watchers. It's broadcast number 729, and it's November the 25th, 1985. I hope you all have a nice Thanksgiving. It's hard to believe that 1 month from now Christmas will be here and the new year again will be rolling around. It all went so fast. Please give books for Christmas gifts, for holiday gifts. It's very important to keep informed on what is happening. There are a lot of good writers. The material is there. There are a lot of serious problems taking place in the world today, and I think they can be systematically and scientifically pinpointed to the origin of their causes. There isn't so much guesswork anymore, and much of it goes back to the very reasons that people are politically assassinated, and as I mentioned last week, to control the masses and the resources, it is necessary to use murder as a tool, as William Buckley acknowledged in his book, and as the State Department wrote in their various doctrines, such as George Kennan's that I cited just last week. In the book The Kennedy Conspiracy, written by Paris Flamone, in 1969, he had an introduction to American assassinations in general. Now, this was 1 year before the Project Paperclip came out, the Torba document, Reinhard Galen's Spy of the Century, 2 years before. And he said about American assassinations, he said the President of the United States, John Kennedy, was murdered November 22nd, 1963. The civil rights leader Martin Luther King was killed April the 4th, 1968. 2 days later, the United States Attorney General Ramsey Clark announced only a single person was involved in the killing of Martin Luther King. There was no evidence of a widespread plot. 1 month later, Attorney General Robert Kennedy was murdered in the Ambassador Hotel. June 5th, 1968. The same Attorney General, Ramsey Clark, said there is no evidence of a conspiracy, only the evidence of an individual act. And Paris Flamone said the archetypical assassination of John Kennedy established a pattern of political behavior for the entire decade, and following the appalling day in Dallas, 6 major factional slaughters, 1 every 9 months, were accomplished, and many killings of less famous persons. Kennedy's murder actually seems to have deranged some part of the American psyche. The death of Malcolm X denied American blacks their most magnetic leader. The killing of Medgar Evers manifested Burke's admonition, when bad men combine, the good must associate, else they will fall one by one. The age of the assassin has arrived in the United States. No rational American can doubt it any longer. Political murder may have become a more common practice in our land than in any other country in the Western world. The list of the dead grows, and he started to cite some of them. John Kennedy, Malcolm X, George Lincoln Rockwell, who I mentioned last week, the Fuhrer of the American Nazi Party, Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. Why is Rockwell in this list along with the civil rights people and the so-called liberal establishment that the State Department wrote in their documents would welcome or allow communism in, and therefore these people have to be killed? Because when Rockwell was murdered in 1967, a further right gentleman from the Pentagon took over by the name of William Pierce, a physicist, a graduate with a Ph.D., who worked for the Air Force and for United Technology, for Pratt Whitney, and then went into the Nazi Party and changed the name to the National Alliance and became more militaristic with direct tentacles into the Defense Department. And then he cites less prominent, but just as dead, Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney. And he cites those 3 who were killed by the Klan in the South. Now, the current Miss America, her father and grandfather were part of the planning of the murder of Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, and we have come so far in the American psyche that in 1985, as I mentioned before on a broadcast, you can remove a black Miss America if she had been photographed in the nude, but you promote Miss Mississippi and then Miss America when her father and her grandfather arranged, and one was indicted but acquitted by an all-white jury of the murder of people cited in this chapter in 1969. That's how far we've come in 1985. And in this particular introduction of Paris Flammonde, he said the fatal shooting of the long underrated American Nazi, George Lincoln Rockwell, was, in all probability, an interscene conflict resulting from a combination of quest for greater power, and later it turns over that it not only is greater power, but it is linked to our Defense Department. He said there are mysteries in the half-abandoned labyrinth. For example, why was the National Security American Nazi Party, Dan Burroughs, who also was murdered in the presence of Rockwell, and Lincoln Rockwell from Arlington, Virginia, why were they listed in the address book of Lee Harvey Oswald? No one ever asked why Medgar Evers was struck down. We presume that he had the right of opportunity for people of color in his country, and he was shot down by white racists. And what prerogative do they have because of his particular pigmentation? He died because he was black. Who financed the killers and who activated them? And these are the questions in the introduction to the Kennedy conspiracy that are very important today. And he reiterates the murder of Malcolm Evers, Mr. Schwenner, Goodman, and Cheney, the civil rights people killed in Mississippi. And as I say, today we see the promotion of this woman who was a baby at the time. Should you make her pay for the sins of her parents? No, it is the symbolism. Just as Bitburg was the symbolism in 1985 for the president to lay a wreath with the Waffen-SS, Miss America can come from a father and a grandfather who fueled the car that drove the man who murdered the civil rights leaders, and that is acceptable in 1985 if you want it to be acceptable. He also mentions that Truman Capote was speculating on the possibility that the murders of Kennedy, King, and Kennedy, John and Robert, were elements of one vast intrigue. But we all know how Truman Capote was silenced, and he also was dead in 1985. So in the introduction to the Kennedy conspiracy, which will be with us all for all time, and before the links of the Nazis and NASA came together with the Kennedy assassination, the Star Wars team, and the murder of the people he listed, he was asking questions, Paris Flammonde, about the American psyche of accepting these stories of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, even the murder of George Lincoln Rockwell, and Medgar Evers, Cheney, Schwerner, Goodman, Louisa, as well as others. And he asked the question, the real question is not what is an assassin, but who is he? Who are they? The momentous question no longer is simply, was any individual assassination a conspiracy, but there is a greater conspiracy than has been heretofore been conceived, he asked, an incredible plot to eliminate the liberal, the humanistic, and the leaders of America. This is Paris Flammonde, and he doesn't get much publicity as an author on the Kennedy assassination. In his book, The Kennedy Conspiracy, goes into Clay Shaw and Permindex and the Montreal connections of the Nazis to the murder of John Kennedy and to the Odessa network that does in fact exist today, which the rabbi in Sao Paulo, Brazil, made Mr. Romeo Tumo negate, as I mentioned several weeks ago. So Paris Flammonde understood by his work by 1969 that these elements were there to eliminate the liberal, the humanistic, the leaders. And those documents I cited that came out in 1948 on doing away with the humanistic, the liberal, the concerned, or even the democracies was stated in printing in State Department papers in 1948. And as they escalated the murders of these leaders, people like Paris Flammonde caught on and put an introduction to the book, The Kennedy Conspiracy, that we, in fact, are a country neutralized, such as Central America, South America, Southeast Asia, Europe, Africa, of course Africa, Middle East, that we also are killing off as well as we are killing the leaders in all these various countries. And the interesting thing after my 22 years research is that no matter what I read or no matter what's published, it all fits together and it comes back to the same teams the same names and organizations who have been doing this planning all along. I'm grateful to Larry Flynt and very proud of the fact that I was able to publish in the Rebel the article on the Nazi connections to the Kennedy assassination, because I think those are the first that have been published in this form in the United States, even though it cost Larry Flynt his magazine, The Hustler, and the military people moved into his house, and all hell broke loose for Larry Flynt. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have done that. Now, Jim Garrison, the former district attorney in New Orleans, who's a judge in New Orleans now, is coming out with a book on the Odessa connections to the murder of John Kennedy. He was one of the first people who told me about Reinhard Gehlen's connections to Clay Shaw when I went to New Orleans in 1967. And I was putting together the Solidarists and the White Russians and the Gehlen operation, figuring it out myself by just taking the testimony and the exhibits of the Warren Commission hearings that I was going through with a fine-tooth comb, and spent 9 years studying. Now I want to go back and continue where I left last week with the Mengele story, because this has to do with that Odessa network and drug connections, assassinations, but this particular story is very interesting, and I don't want to leave it. I want to continue it this week, part 2. Out of the Tampa Tribune, this is June the 28th, 1985. And just to get the date straight, because it's always interesting to see this in the perspective, June the 22nd, 1985, is when Romeo Tuma, the police chief down in Sao Paulo, Brazil, lied about that body, the skull, being Joseph Mengele. Now, the reason they have to lie about that is Tomasi Buscetta, who's now the primary witness in the drug trials in New York City and in Italy, I guess the courts in Palermo, Italy. He came out of Sao Paulo, Brazil, as well as his cohort drug dealer that I mentioned several weeks ago on the radio program. And their headquarters were in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and their money was deposited in many, many banks, but two in particular, or two institutions, is again E.F. Hutton, and Mr. Scott Pierce, the president of E.F. Hutton, is the brother-in-law of George Bush, and the other is Merrill Lynch, the stockbroker, recipients of millions of dollars of the narcotics traffic that checked directly down to Sao Paulo, Brazil, and the chief of staff of the White House was the chairman of Merrill Lynch before he went on to a cabinet position with Reagan and now is at the White House. So to get the time straight on the Tampa Tribune from Ted Rubenstein, who he sent to David Emery and me, I just want to continue the details on that the two people who deposited the money in those institutions, one was Gaetano Badalamenti, Badalamenti, and he has been in court, and Mr. Tomasi Buscetta has been testifying about him and their drug dealing, the headquarters of their operation out of Sao Paulo, Brazil. And they were the fellows described April 10th in 1984 in the LA Times as depositing the money, as I say, into E.F. Hutton and into Merrill Lynch. I'll get back to that later, but that's the groundwork of the Sao Paulo network, and that's why the story now of Kaiser is so important. And in the book Forces of Power, Mr. Taub talks about his friend and co-partner. He rented his apartment in New York to Father Morleon. I wrote about him in my article on the Nazis and John Kennedy assassination in the Rebel in November, is the November issue, 1983, 2 years ago, about Father Morleon. And it turned out that Morleon's apartment building in Rome is also the place that Mr. Antonov, the defendant in the trial of the assassination attempt against the Pope, rented in that apartment building. So Taub he's a very important witness because of his close friendship with Jimmy Hoffa, and he tells about who killed Jimmy Hoffa in his book, and then that person was allegedly hired by the Chevion construction company, Raymond Donovan, who Secretary of Labor is on trial for his links to the crime syndicate and various contracts out of his construction company with the mafia. So when they wanted to wipe out William Taub, Ernest Kaiser was the person to do it. And now here's Ernest Kaiser saying he knows where Joseph Mengele is as of May of 1985, and that was his trump card for being left alone, obviously, was to pull out the Mengele. And what I said all along was that Mr. and Mrs. Bossert put a body in a coffin who they said drowned for the purpose of, in case there was extortion or blackmail on Joseph Mengele being alive, they could pull those bones out of the box. And pull them out they did exactly 1 week after the court hearing, or the public hearing, where the testimony about Mengele's being alive came up at the Tampa trial. Now, I left off last week where Keiser was shot. He was supposed to help this president of the bank, the Metropolitan Bank, by getting off of charges against him, his financial chicanery down there, by producing Robert Vesco. And his papers and material were taken. The Vesco papers were grabbed from him in Washington, D.C., his satchel. So he took a powder and went off to Germany. And the man who helped him leave, a Mr. Hinshaw, gave him $100,000. He left his a lot of the stuff. His home is in Virginia. Goodness knows what will happen. $300,000 home. His wife, his butler, and his dogs, the family dogs and so forth, and mother-in-law went to meet him in Germany. And so he is protected in Germany. The estate is in Virginia, and I guess it'll be held. Hopefully, Keiser wants to come back today. Now, Keiser was going to, as I say, produce Joseph Mengele. He went to Germany in February. Manfred Roeder, the attorney that I have been mentioning for many weeks on the broadcast, Manfred Roeder, who links to the Aryan nations up in Idaho and Richard Butler, and is a connection to the Odessa network down in South America, he was arrested. He's in a jail in Germany. When he's not in jail, he's in Idaho to visit, and his wife visits Butler from Lockheed, the head of the Aryan nation. He was in Germany talking about drug charges and terrorism, the connections of drugs, terror, and assassinations as of February this year. And his cohort, a Mr. FIEBELKORN, is also in jail in Germany, who did drug dealing in South America and worked with the P2 and LICIO GELLI out of Bolivia and also Paraguay and Brazil. And FIEBELKORN is in jail talking. So these associations of people who had worked with Mengele, who knew him, and other drug dealers have trials going on in Germany who began revealing in February about Joseph Mengele. And when Manfred Roeder got a letter in jail in February of this year, just from Paraguay, saying Uncle drowned, that was excuse, according to Mr. Blumenthal, the New York Times, for the scramble to find where Joseph Mengele was, and also officially to close the case. And February is when Dr. Curley gets the pictures of a skull, and in June he's to go to South America. So the basis of what Mr. Keiser has, he's German, he worked in the Wehrmacht, he fought in Hitler's army. He has some reason for knowing where Mengele is, and he's between Bonn and Munich, and he's dangling this as Mr. Hinshaw's protection. Don't worry about being prosecuted for helping me get out of the country with all this money. We'll bring in the Mengele story. I'll bring in Mengele. And Hinshaw claims that Keiser tricked him out of $100,000 and went over to Europe and fled the country. And he helped him. They did help him go to Baltimore and then Detroit to the Canadian border and then to London and then to Germany. And he used the passport of a Washington lobbyist, but Ernest Keiser has used many, many passports before. And he took a van and his whole party went to Bonn, Germany. And Stephen Drake, Daniel Stephen Drake, is his valet who went with him. And Joseph and Mr. Keiser, Ernest Keiser, said, in quotes, "I have several meetings with the Israelis in Bonn, Germany, in the suburb of Bad Dosberg. And there was a possibility of his going to Paraguay. He was going down and look for Mengele. He has the leads, and this is of February or so of 1985. He's on his way, Ernest Keiser. He's been shot because of his Vesco papers and connections in the United States. He successfully brought Edwin Wilson to jail, and he says that he has information, and the Israeli intelligence have still said that Joseph Mengele is not dead. They do not say he is dead. Now, the background on Keiser, because of his complicated web, is very interesting to study, and this article gives more details than they ever had about his going to Germany, and that if the expedition captures Mengele, then he's sure that that Mr. Hinshaw and the others will get pardoned for any crimes, and that the scheme will work. But according to this article in the Tampa paper, 1 week later, they said the body was found in Brazil, and Mr. Hinshaw, not being very sophisticated, just simply assisting him and leave the country, had to accept the official story that the corpse that was drowned in 1979 was Joseph Mengele, although the article in the Tampa paper says it is now almost universally accepted or believed it was Mengele. But as I cited last week, there was a meeting in Indiana and also in Germany saying it wasn't him. Now, Kaiser used a lot of aliases. They're described in this article: August von Kaiser, Ernest Ressick, Ernesto Roberto Kaiser, Al Morgan, Udo Friest, Jacob Shermansky, and he has said that he worked for the CIA, for the OSS first. He worked in German Wehrmacht for Adolf Hitler, then the OSS. Otto von Bolschwing worked for the Waffen-SS and then the OSS. He says he worked for U.S. Army military intelligence. I wonder if he knew Henry Kissinger, the young punk over there with CIC, because they have same friends and people in common or activities later on. Kissinger was in charge of Task Force 157 in Washington, D.C., the intelligence operation that hired Edwin Wilson, and Ernest Kaiser brought home Wilson to hush him up so that he couldn't blackmail or extort. And Kissinger, again, and Fritz Kramer are directly linked to being in charge of this secret operation 157, and Wilson has been silenced. You haven't heard anything about Edwin Wilson in the past year. He says Kaiser, they worked for the Drug Administration and the National Security Agency. First accounts were that he was born in New York in 1918 of German parents and went to South America. His education was in Chile and Brazil, and he claims he was taken to Germany in 1942 in the middle of the war. He didn't want to evidently be American if he was born in America, which it turns out he wasn't, but he was in the Wehrmacht in the German with the German army from 1942 on, fighting the Americans and the Russians. He says he survived a couple of times being captured, and in his biography he describes clandestine activities in the Soviet-occupied Central Europe in his war with communism, and he describes himself as, in quotes, the operative. He has black entries that he made inside communist territory and worked as the agency calls a lone wolf. In other words, if he's caught, they don't protect him. If he tried to murder William Taub and he was indicted, he can get off. The intelligence community can pull the court trick, just as they told the Rajneesh, get out of America fast. He hires Miles Ambrose, and within 48 hours he's gone, as wealthy as ever and as criminal as ever. But in this case, you're on your own. You can't use the agencies. Kaiser worked in the Middle East, and this is very important because of the Middle East connection to San Paulo and Mengele and the police chief down there and Henry Arsan, and the drug connections from Syria and the people in South America that played a connecting role. His cover for a lot of activity was as a freelance journalist. I mentioned last week that Carl Stewart, whose real name was Schonberger, who also was a German. You read about a newspaper set up by Carl Stewart, and you don't know his name is a Schonberger from Germany, who had the independent press system in Cuba. And again, this German's cover, Mr. Kaiser's cover under different names, was a freelance journalist, and he worked out of Cairo and Beirut and Tangier and activities in the Middle East, very familiar with it. And he's on intimate terms with King Hussein of Jordan. Also, Jordan has very close links to our intelligence community. He was the recipient, he and his wife, of Lockheed spy money, but as soon as that story came out, one of his many wives was killed in an airplane crash when the links of him to the Lockheed spy money came out. Now, as far as South America, Kaiser, according to this article in the Tampa Tribune, June 28th, says that he's very familiar with the drug trade in South America, in Bogota, Colombia, in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil, in Mexico City, in the Bahamas, and out of Fort Lauderdale, Texas. And then they ask the question, where did he really come from? The birth certificate isn't available in New York. There was supposed to be a fire at the hospital. There's no record of his birth certificate. And the author of this article said he served the German army, as I say, in World War II, and he showed up in 1948 serving time in an Austrian prison, and then Interpol began to classify some of his various arrests, but they weren't so serious that they didn't trust Edwin Wilson of Task Force 157, who worked with Robert Keith Gray, now the head of the Public Relations Office, the powerhouse in Washington, and the U.S. intelligence used him to bring in Wilson. So whatever their denials, they had the number one big fish of terrorism and CIA or Nugan money and assassination, death squads, and drugs, and they gave him to Kaiser, who brought him home and put him in a clink where you don't hear from him. So whatever he is or whoever he is, he's very important to the intelligence community because Edwin Wilson was one of their top people. Now, they had trouble with his fingerprints. This article says when he was first arrested, he fled the country. On this indictment, something funny happened. The article says apparently his fingerprints aren't like ordinary men, that they can't be categorized by standard methods, that the fingerprints after the court hearing in Tampa were taken 5 times and then a 6th time, and they had technical difficulties taking his prints. Now, with all these aliases and fighting in Hitler's Wehrmacht and being a scoundrel who's in various countries under various covers, I think of Colonia Dignidad, that territory between Chile and Argentina, where the top Nazis went for face surgery and finger surgery, where they did peel off fingers. And Michael Townley, one of the CIA people working in Chile with the military police, with Mr. Pinochet, who was involved with the murder of Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffat in Washington, D.C., while George Bush was CIA director. He was trained and worked down in Colonia Dignidad, and the stories of that place tell about their tampering with fingerprints. Now to the story of the bank, the Metropolitan Bank, which collects and makes a cycle to a lot of other work that I've done. It pulls in a lot of people that I've talked about on the air, and then into this scene or milieu comes Ernest Kaiser, who introduces himself to that situation with all of his past relationships and knowledge of Germany, Middle East, South America, drugs, assassinations, and so forth. In 1982, there was a bank failure at the Metropolitan Bank in Tampa, Florida. In July of 1984, the head of the bank, the former president of the bank, Donald REAGAR, R-E-G-A-R, was arrested based upon the collapse of what was Florida's biggest bank failure. And in comes Ernest Kaiser, who volunteers to help him. He says, I have influence in the Justice Department, and he was very close to Mr. Bartello. That's the fellow that prosecuted Edwin Wilson, who spoke up for Kaiser and said, yes, he's a great guy. So, and Donald REAGAR, the president of the Metropolitan Bank, wanted the case, evidently wanted it fixed, because he paid money. He paid this con man, Kaiser, thought he could do it to help him with the charges that were bothering him down there in Tampa, Florida. And the catch was, according to Kaiser, and I stated before, I'll bring in Robert Vesco, like I did Edwin Wilson, and the Justice Department that wants Robert Vesco will be so grateful that they will blow your case. This was his logic. Vesco's wanted for a fraud of $224,000. He was living in Costa Rica. He's living in Cuba at the time. Now, REAGAR turned in Kaiser. It wasn't going to work. As I say, Kaiser was shot and fled the country, and he pleaded guilty to the bank case, and he told the Justice Department what was happening. In return, he received probation. Nothing happened to him anyway. He didn't have to put up the money. But he went to the federal officials, and he told them that he wanted to bring in Kaiser, who took his money for the fixing, and he realized that Kaiser couldn't help him. The promises that everything would be taken care of. Now, Kaiser was arrested, pulled in for allegedly making this deal, and Mr. REAGAR, the head of the Metropolitan Bank, temporarily was put in jail, released later. Then Kaiser got bail, and he simply walked out, just as the Bhagwan Rajneesh walked out. In Oregon, the past 2 weeks, Miles Ambrose of the Drug Enforcement Agency and his scandalous record with Interpol and with the team of G. Gordon Liddy and the White House plumbers, Kaiser has that same inroad into the highest levels of intelligence. and drug enforcement and so forth. So he walked out. He didn't have to put up any cash, and he left the home and went away to Europe, as I say. And Larry Barcella, the head of the, he's a U.S. magistrate, had told the powers that be that Kaiser has a unique background and that he helped with the Wilson Project and that he got the approval of the government and the Justice Department for what he was doing. So they assumed with that he would appear in court, that he would want to stay in the United States, and he put up a $1 million personal security bond with his home as security, and then he left the country. He didn't have much cash, and the fellow who helped Kaiser, as I said, has been prosecuted for helping him leave the country. We'll take a 1-minute break from World Watchers, and then I'll go back to Mr. Kaiser and the bank in Tampa, Florida, and that convoluted story, which interestingly enough should have any role with Ernest Kaiser and the airplane crash in the Potomac River near Florida, the crash that I described on a lot of broadcasts earlier, 1982. This is Mae Brussell, and it's the second half of World Watchers, a program investigating and exploring certain characters who weave in and out of not the fiction, the nonfiction part of history, connections to Nazis, to death squads, narcotics traffic, gun running, political assassinations, and specifically in this case, Ernest Kaiser, an American, passed off as an American and German, Ernest von Kaiser, who now it turns out has a questionable background that nobody knows of and a part in Hitler's army intelligence and so forth, and useful as an example to kill a man like William Taub at the time of Watergate. Nothing against Taub particularly, except that he hires hit teams to kill Taub, who has information, whether it's on Josephine Baker or Jimmy Hoffa, or produces a movie titled Z, or on the Greek military fascists that took over Greece. He was producing that movie, but a person could be murdered for that, and Ernest Kaiser's role was there. And then all of a sudden he attaches to a case that has to do with the Metropolitan Bank in Tampa, Florida. Now, way back in 1982, 3 years ago, January, just 3 years ago, I started a broadcast, it was number 529, and consecutively 530, 531, 532, and 533, 5 weeks in a row, I discussed the connections and the possible reasons for sabotaging Air Florida, the airplane that went into the Potomac River, and the involvement of the CIA. And I mentioned George Bush and his suspicious connections to that flight, January the 25th. January 31st, I talked again about George Bush and his role to that, not his role, but relationship to a person who drowned on that plane who worked for him, and the spy possibilities of the passenger list of the people on the plane. And the second broadcast, I brought up the names of Fred Fielding, the current attorney in the White House, he's from Watergate fame, who works for Ronald Reagan, and Richard Allen, who was dismissed as the National Security Advisor because of payoffs from Japan, and Robert Vesco. Now, I was referring to Robert Vesco and the suspicious airplane that went down in the Potomac River 3 years ago. So it's interesting that in 1985, an article comes out about this Ernest Kaiser, who indeed had papers and documents and worked with or was knowledgeable about Robert Vesco, and who also is interested or concerned with a man whose bank has something to do with that particular plane crash. And then the next week, 531, I was talking about the connections, this was in February 82, of Muammar Gaddafi and Edwin Wilson to the airplane crash, Air Florida, that went into the Potomac. And coincidentally or not, but I don't think so, and I think my research was pretty accurate, the same Ernest Kaiser who is messing into the Metropolitan Bank that had I think, a deciding factor in this plane crash He's the one that brought Edwin Wilson of Task Force 157 back into a prison. Wilson tried to get Keiser killed and also Bartello, the prosecutor. But I was talking about George Bush, Robert Vesco, and Edwin Wilson, and all of those tap into and have to do with Ernest Keiser, who in 1985 is linked in this article in Tampa, Florida, to those events. In 1982, February, I did more on Air Florida, and very seldom do I take any particular subject and do 5 weeks of it in such depth. I've done some Jonestown and a few events, but usually it's 2 or 3 weeks and you get a good groundwork and we can update it later. But I was very interested in that airplane crash that went down, and I feel I did a very good job. And those of you who have the back broadcast, you can listen to them again. And in the Wall Street Journal in March of 82, the 5th broadcast I did on that airplane crash, it had to do with, the Wall Street Journal story was called Tumble in Tampa. And it has to do with a $53 million hunk of money missing from Fort Collins, Colorado, that could link to Wilson and Turple and a Mr. Tafoya. $51 million missing from Atlanta, Georgia. And the Tampa, Florida bank collapsing, the largest bank collapse since 1976, and a Richard Greco, the vice president of the Super Bowl, and the Metropolitan Bank. The Tampa and Florida article goes into the Metropolitan Bank and their loans of millions of dollars to an Alan Wolfson with no collateral, and the bank examiner for the Metropolitan Bank, the large bank that collapsed, was a Mr. Williams, who was on Air Florida. Now, at the time the plane collapsed, there were people at the bridge as if they were waiting and knowing where it was going to crash, just as the Dorothy Hunt plane crash went down in over Chicago at the height of Watergate. And Sherman Skolnick did that marvelous work that the FBI men were circling around all where it was going to crash. And there was an order not to identify a passenger on the plane. And, of course, I knew something was wrong right away. They didn't want his name in the media or to be recognized, and that was a hint of a major problem. And already 3 weeks had gone by, or 4 weeks, when this article came out in the Wall Street Journal. And the reason that I knew they didn't want him to be identified, and he did in turn, in fact, his name was Mr. Williams, described as the hero in the plane crash. At the beginning, they said the hero remains a mystery, and the Wall Street Journal identified him as the bank examiner from the Atlanta, Georgia Federal Reserve, who was called in to check out the banking problems. We're talking about not 101 million, but a lot of money, and it had to do with the 49ers and Mr. Bartello and scandals from the East and the Midwest and, of course, out to California. It was a big story, and Mr. Williams was one of those people who allegedly passed up 5 different times when a helicopter could have helped him to help other people. But I don't know why the chief investigator for this scandalous tangled web would choose to die at this time, or was the hero story created by the same law enforcement that let him die that forbid his being identified until much later? Even if he died a natural death, they could have identified him at that moment. But there was all this mystery. So the bank examiner to the Metropolitan Bank situation was killed on the Air Florida, and Arlen Williams was given some kind of an award by Ronald Reagan the past year. His wife was called in, and he was recognized as a hero at that particular instance, even though they tried to cover it up. Now, the Tampa Tribune, September the 17th, 1984, had a story, Secret Plea Bargain Alleged and Denied, and that went in Donald Reagan, the former Metropolitan Bank president, the one whose bank was being investigated by the late Mr. Williams. And I had early identified Edwin Wilson and George Bush and Robert Vesco connections, to that crash. So the Tampa Tribune, this was again given by Ted Rubenstein, who gets papers for David and me from the back east. I don't get the Florida papers. And Mr. Donald Reagan, the head of the bank, had charges dropped. He was guilty. He had 15 counts of banking violations. They found him guilty of 2, and they dropped 13. Now along comes Mr. Keiser into this tangled web where he's only held for 2 charges and 13 are dropped. a self-professed CIA man who had been arrested in Tampa in 1984 and wants to help him get out of those charges, as I say, for the fee that he'll bring in Robert Vesco. And Robert Vesco at that time, see, you have to put it back in its time slot. This was 1982 when this was going on. Robert Vesco, who took money from the investment overseas operation, worked with Bernie Cornfeld. He was close to Bernie Cornfeld, who was cohabiting with Vicki Morgan at the time, the woman who had her head crashed in with a baseball bat several years ago. And if you read the paper this week, Mr. Marvin Pancoast is dying of AIDS. The man who was charged with killing her has AIDS. He's at Vacaville Prison. And there were no fingerprints on the baseball bat, and there was somebody else in the closet, and her documents and papers were taken. She had her skull crushed in. He took the rap. Now he's dying of AIDS. Now, Robert Vesco, in this time period in 1982 in Tampa, when that went down, was floating around the Caribbean. He had been a former partner, worked with in different ways in California, New Jersey, and so forth, with William Casey. The best background on Vesco, there's many books on him, is Still Spooks, the one by Jim Hogan, and partners with Bernie Cornfeld. Now, a woman was cohabiting between the house of Cornfeld and Alfred Bloomingdale. That was Vicki Morgan, and Alfred Bloomingdale was on Ronald Reagan's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, working with the Defense Department. She was over in Europe with the King of Morocco and heads of states. Vicki Morgan was in this milieu of Cornfeld and Bloomingdale and United States intelligence, and Vesco was a plum that they would like to bring in so that he can't blackmail them, or maybe he's on a salary and stays in Cuba and the United States is afraid to bring him here because if there's any trials, we'd have the same situation that you have with Klaus Barbie in France. His story can't go to trial even though he's arrested in 1983 because it would shake this country. Vesco's story would shake this country and Reagan and Nixon, and Barbie would shake the so-called left or the resistance or the people that were passed off as opposing fascism who actually work for the Nazis. We have the same thing in this country with the people around John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, and as soon as the two boys were wiped out, they went to the Hughes organization and to Robert Keith Gray and Mr. Mankiewicz and Mr. Schlesinger and the whole team, Larry O'Donnell, and the whole team around John Kennedy were traitors to him, never cared who killed him, and if the truth of the Kennedy murder came out, there's more than you would want to know. The tangled web of spies, traitors, deception, friendships that are thrown out the window when the selected patsy is murdered. Their true cover comes out by their silence, and the silence is actually loud. It's loud and clear how they keep the truth from coming out. Burke Marshall was another one, and I could go on and on. The traitors to the assassinations, the deceivers, the assassins left in the grave, and they take on other positions. Now, Vesco can't go to trial. That would be impossible, and Klaus Barbie is still dangling there. New York Times, Jeff Gerth had a story February the 3rd, 1985. See, the Air Florida went down in the Potomac River with the investigator in 1982. Tampa Tribune has a story about Donald Reagan, the Metropolitan Bank president, and the charges being reduced, and about Ernest von Kaiser. December the 5th, 1984, the Houston Post has a story. So now it's just 2 months later, February the 3rd, 1985. Jeff Gerth is one of the best writers on organized crime syndicates for the New York Times. He says Ernest Kaiser has now left the United States himself. This is in February. He's a fugitive wanted on a trial in Tampa, Florida for interfering with the Metropolitan Bank case. And the question is, what did he know? Why did Ernest Kaiser put himself into that at all, a top-level spy, to get into that case at all? And Gerth writes, he's been charged with defrauding Donald Reagan of $60,000. To get him off, he's fled to Germany, to Munich, then Bonn. He portrayed himself to Mr. Reagan as a secret government operative involved in snaring Now, this is the interesting part that Jeff Gerst writes about in 1984. He was involved in snaring Nazis and hiding them in South America, illegally putting some into communist countries to free the dissidents there. He's involved in drug rings and high-level drug rings in the Middle East. Now, Tomasi Buscetta from Syria was the drug activist, the primary witness now in the trial in New York and Italy. Out of Sao Paulo, Brazil, Romeo Tuma, the chief of police who lied about the Mengele corpse, as that being Joseph Mengele, is from Syria, who's worked with the death squads and the Nazis in South America. Henry Arsan, and I'll do more on him next week on the drugs and murder and assassinations, who was killed in a jail in Italy, was the top Syrian head of the connections of Banco Ambrosiano, the P2, LICIO GELLI, who attended Ronald Reagan's inauguration, links to the Reverend Moon, and so forth. That tangled web of the P2. Arsan was from Syria. Buscetta, Tuma, Arsan, and this group are involved with the Syrian drug running and narcotics. And here's Mr. Keiser in 1985 of February talking about working with Nazis hiding in South America. Now, I read that in February 85, and I wasn't thinking anything of Keiser with Nazis in South America and drug running in South America or the Middle East. And February 85 is when attorney Manfred Roeder gets a jail letter from Paraguay that's the official opening of this case. Uncle is dead, he drowned. And February 85 is when the witness, the medical witness for the CIA, the pathologist, Mr. Curley, is getting pictures of a skull to do his story. So that in this time period, Jeff Gerst is talking about Ernest Keiser's relationship to Nazis in South America, to drug running, and he himself is in Bonn, Germany in February, and that's when the top drug dealers are making the connection that Mengele is alive, that he deals drugs with Klaus Barbie, that they saw him and lived with him, and that's when the escalation of the reward money came, as the drug dealers were arrested in Germany, and where they are located is where Ernest Keiser moved to, and Keiser knew all of them, and Keiser is saying to the man who helped him escape, I'll bring in Mengele, and I guess he thought he would get the $3 million reward. What I'm trying to do for you, and not going too fast, is to show you that certain people that I've done broadcasts about, and also see Taub, who was left to be murdered by Ernest Keiser, and Keiser was charged with the attempted murder, was familiar with the Vatican intelligence, the people who set up the lie that the plans to kill the Pope were the KGB and the Bulgarians, the leftists, as against the right wing, LICIO GELLI of the P2, Francesco Pazienza, the friend of Alexander Haig, and Michael Ledeen of National Security Agency, and Claire Sterling and Paul Hense. This whole group who created that lie about the Ja's links to the leftists are tied to the milieu of Mr. William Taub, who was to be murdered, to the Air Florida investigator who went down on the plane, the connections of Bush, Vesco, and Edwin Wilson in that milieu to the Air Florida crash, and Keiser, who interjects himself into the bank that was being investigated, and his links to Nazis in South America, and he's German himself, and fought in Hitler's army, and lived in Brazil, lived in the Middle East, and is familiar with all of these things, and knows where to go, just as the Israeli intelligence had given this other fellow who was murdered in 1983, Mr. Stewart, the papers and the orders of where Joseph Mengele had actually signed the papers for his father and mother's murder. Now, this man is dead, so you can't compare those fingerprints or that order, if it's on there, of Mengele. His wife killed him 2 years ago. She's going to trial now. So the Mengele thing has been brewing for a long time, and I think only Mae Brussell on World Watchers for 2 years, since the arrest of Klaus Barbie and John DeLorean, and through the friends that I know have been to South America who have talked to Joseph Mengele, not recently, but a while back, who know all the inroads of the whole story and knew the pilot of the airplane that brought in the cocaine. There are many of them, but this was the biggest one for all of the Hollywood, Los Angeles area, William Hedrick. I was making these connections of their being alive and trafficking in drugs, and only in February, when these people started talking in their jails about the drug connections, then the CIA released the papers that, yes, Mengele was in drug dealing in 1979. Yes, the CIA knew it. Yes, it's secret. They didn't care about A, stopping the drug traffic, B, stopping the arms traffic that goes to the dictators, because that was the goal stated in 1945 and 48, as I mentioned last week, the papers of the State Department. Get rid of the democracies, get rid of the liberals, and put in the dictatorships, because then you don't have a chance that the left seeks in. That's what H.L. Hunt was doing with the American Volunteer Group, described in the book Spooks. Kill the left, kill the liberals. If you have a liberal, you let a communist in the door. If you have a democracy, you let a communist in the door. You have to kill these people. So Kaiser was part of that hit team. And also, if I don't have time this week, I'm going next week into the Rajneesh, because I think they're part of that Nazi network of drugs, assassinations, and one of the key factors in in buying the property out of, in Oregon, out of India they came, and then bought this Muddy River property up in Oregon. The papers were done, the bank work was done, the property was owned from the bank in Dallas, Texas, the very bank where Jack Ruby went, the offices that H.L. Hunt had, the Mercantile Building, in Dallas, Texas, the same office where Connie Trammell went with Jack Ruby 2 days before John Kennedy was killed, out of the Mercantile Bank of Dallas, Texas, with all the banks in the entire world that there are. How come the money for this Rajneesh ranch in Oregon came and was held in the Mercantile Bank in Dallas, Texas, and how come the attorney that got him out of this country within 48 hours was the same Ambrose who worked and set up Interpol with J. Edgar Hoover with his international Nazi Odessa network, and who worked with G. Gordon Liddy with the Gestapo techniques, who set up the White House Plumbers, which was a drug enforcement agency that worked with the death squads in South America. It gets way beyond coincidence that every major news story that we get of drugs and murders, attempted murders, and so forth, all connect to the same cities, the same banks, and have been connecting for the past 22 years. Before then, too, but I began studying it 22 years ago, so I'm talking about current things right now. The connection of these particular operations and these people to the White House, to Merrill Lynch, and to E.F. Hutton. First, well, I'm sure it's been in many articles, but the first time I noticed it was April the 10th, 1984, Los Angeles Times, the article titled, U.S. Smashes Drug Ring, $1.65 billion, written by John Goldman, that the federal government announced, and this was a year and a half ago, the huge international narcotics ring that for over 5 years smuggled $1.65 billion of heroin into the United States and distributed through mafia-run pizza parlors as conduits for cash and drugs. Now, 1979 is the exact year in February where the Bosuts were to say that Mengele drowned. And this article pinpoints the time, how long this had been going on, and it wasn't until February of 1985 that the CIA was forced to admit that they knew back to the year 1979, and knew goodness knows how much time before that, and after that they knew of Mengele's drug dealing. Now, 31 people had been arrested in New York City by a ring headed by Gaetano Badalamenti, one of the world's greatest heroin importers, and his companion Salvatore Catalano. They were arrested. Well, Badalamenti is the co-partner with Mr. Tomasi Buscetta, and several weeks ago I cited where Buscetta was testifying about his relationship with Badalamenti, and they were down in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and they were questioning whether they would be able to come back to the United States and again in the New York Times, November the 4th, 1985. tells about Buscetta's relationship with Badalamenti and working out of San Paulo. Would they be able to go back to Palermo, Italy? And now it seems that Mr. Buscetta is testifying against Badalamenti, his co-partner, in exchange for, obviously, he'll get a light charge and the others will be caught with the drug dealing. But I mentioned before, and probably I'll be updating it many times, the same attorney representing Buscetta, Tomasi Buscetta, tied to Henry Arsan and the Milan Mafia and the Vatican and Paul Marcinkus and the late Roberta Calvi and so forth, the same attorney representing him that he ends up as a kingpin testifying against his partner is the attorney that represented the Boserts, who said Mengele was dead, and Mr. Wagner, Gustav Wagner, the Nazi war criminal who was allowed to stay in Brazil. So that what we have here are a bunch of thieves, this one turning on the other one. But in the article in the New York Times a year and a half ago, it mentions Badalamenti's arrest, and it tells about how they delivered money to a hotel in New York City, the Waldorf Astoria. According to the FBI affidavits that were released in 1984, the ring laundered their cash through two New York brokerage firms, Merrill Lynch and Company and E.F. Hutton and Company, and through banks in Switzerland, the Bahamas, and Bermuda. Now, isn't that a coincidence that the money should go to E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch? In March '82, according to this deposition, the Merrill Lynch security guard was sent to the Waldorf Astoria by a Franco Delatore. He wanted protection to go down to Wall Street. He deposited $1 million in cash in an account named Trax, Traex. From March until July, Delatore put another $9 million into Merrill Lynch and E.F. Hutton. Between July and September, he deposited another $2.25 million more with these two firms on 11 different transactions. October the 5th, 1982, E.F. Hutton was served with a grand jury subpoena regarding the cash that was going into that stock brokerage house. Now, it isn't, or how can it be such a coincidence? Is it really a coincidence that Merrill Lynch, the chairman of Merrill Lynch, was none other than Donald Reagan? His title was chairman of the board and chief executive officer of Merrill Lynch until 1981, when Reagan put him as secretary of the Treasury, and then he became the chief of staff in the White House. While all of this is going on, and all those millions of dollars of cash are going into a firm he isn't separated from, and since 1982, while he's holding a cabinet position and Henry Arsan has been arrested, the connections are going to the Vatican, to drug running, to the Bahamas, to Bermuda, to Swiss banks, over $1.5 billion into a company such as Merrill Lynch, who sits as a cabinet member of Ronald Reagan's administration. And the other firm that received the money, the president of that firm is Scott Pierce, George Bush's brother-in-law. And I always believe that Barbara Bush, for various activities that she'd gone into, was working with the CIA. Her brother became the president of E.F. Hutton. William Safire wrote an article in May of this year that I had on the air. Pierce, he said, Pierce, this is George Bush's brother-in-law, was assigned to oversee the retail branches of Hutton's Hot Summer of 1982, when federal and local investigators were shaken up and when E.F. Hutton's president George Ball lost to take over Prudential Baquet. Now, in 1982, in June 82, the Bank Ambrosia scandal went full scale, and I'll detail the chronology for you a little more next week because time is running out now. The president of E.F. Hutton is taken off, and the brother-in-law of the vice president of the United States, who was the former director of the CIA, who worked with Edwin Wilson and Task Force 157 and Ernest Kaiser, George Bush's brother-in-law, is going to handle E.F. Hutton, where the money from Buscetta and Badalamenti and the gun running and the narcotics traffic is being put into banks in Wall Street in New York City. When, after the arrest in June 82 and the murder of Calvi, the arrest of Henry Arsan and that gang, the brother-in-law, the vice president, moves into the institution where the money was being deposited, and a cabinet member becomes chief of staff for the White House when his institution is the recipient of this money And these two bases are covered, and at the same time, in June 82, or early in 82, is when Raymond Donovan was cleared the second time for his links to organized crime, to the Genovese family, the Schiavone Construction Company, to the murder of two primary witnesses that were wiped out in that summer of 82, that hot summer of 82. He still hasn't been given a sentence, or the trial hasn't started for Donovan. All these three people, and Paul Laxalt has a lawsuit coming up regarding his contacts or alleged contacts with organized crime coming out of Las Vegas, Nevada. So this is the Ronald Reagan team that are directly linked, no guessing about it, time sequence and so forth, not only to these scandals, to the cabinet positions, but to the lies that force these people to say that Mengele is dead when Mengele worked with these people in South America, and the Central Intelligence Agency knew it. Now, they're not getting away with it. As I say, there's been investigations, and they will indeed prove that Joseph Mengele did not die down there. But the reason they're lying are the convoluted webs that go to so many characters involved in things such as Downing, Air Florida, bank failures, missing millions of dollars, drug traffic, and murders. There is a concentrated team of people working and covering that are in operation now, and the trials are what is bringing this out. Good books, good articles, and the current trials, people talking at their trials, are the things that are putting these pieces together. Well, I run out of time again this hour. I don't know about you. It goes fast for me. I don't know if it goes fast for you. I'll be back with you next week to continue and do the connections of the Rajneesh to some of this, the Bhagwan Rajneesh who ran out of the country a couple of weeks ago. This is Mae Brussell. Thanks again for the articles and clippings, and I'll be back with you next week.